Today, Rob is presenting on 6 months into bushfire recovery, problems and survival. Rob will discuss the second 6 months of disaster recovery, the trauma, loss and stress causing disruption in bushfire affected communities, the impact of continuing stress on thinking, decision-making, emotions and action, and the added impact of COVID, the restrictions that have been enforced, and the social and financial impacts on individuals and families resulting from isolation. So it's a lot to get through, but I will now introduce our wonderful presenter, Dr. Rob Gordon. Rob is a clinical psychologist and expert in mental health first aid and supporting people affected by bushfires. He has been working alongside BRV, providing advice and sessions like this for bushfire affected people and communities. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks very much, Angela. Good morning, everybody. I've been working with bushfires since 1983, when I got my start with Ash Wednesday. And I had the privilege of working with the Macedon area for 4 years during their recovery and began to see some of the patterns. And what I learned then was that often the most important factor determining how people recover is not so much what happens to them on the day, but how they go in the period from around about now through to around about this time next year or the end of next year. In other words, between about 6 months and 2 years. Because it's during this period that time and again, people have told me that things went seriously wrong in their lives. Their relationships came under pressure. They had difficulties in their families. They had difficulties with their physical and mental health, in maintaining their career and so on. It's often a period when personal friendships come to grief in bushfire affected communities. And so what I want to do is try and share with you some of the things I've learned about the way in which stress affects our ability to look after ourselves and to progress all of the issues that we have to deal with in recovery. And then we'll work through to a few ideas about how we take care of ourselves during this time. We're going to have a couple more of these sessions, one on the 26th of August and one on the 8th of September. So we're not going to cover everything today, but the next two sessions will be looking at family, children, youth, and looking at how we network. And the third one will be looking at how do we prepare ourselves for the coming fire season, the whole issue around anniversaries and so on, and move. How do we balance the requirements of recovery with the preparation for next year and not let one sidetrack the other? What I'm going to do is talk about a few things and then break several times so that we can have opportunities for you to ask questions or talk about the points I'm raising. But the first thing I want to do is I'm going to show a couple of slides. The first state we're in when we go through the fire and in the immediate aftermath, as long as we're confronting material threats and serious dangers, we're in the state of stress that I call survival mode, the acute stress, the stress that's generated by immediate tangible threat in our vicinity. I'm going to show a slide here of a picture of this just to get us, just allow me to find this. Now, Angela. I hope you can
Yep, that's good.
let me know if people can see that.
They can see it, yep.
So now these men, it's just a photograph out of the paper from way back in the 90s. And when I saw that, I thought, now that's the perfect picture of this first state, the adrenaline mode. And these men, if you have a look at their faces, you can see what adrenaline does. They're carrying a woman out of a fire in a cinema. And you can see how rapidly they've grabbed her. They haven't even really got her in a proper hold. But have a look at this man's face. You can see something that's been shown in research on adrenaline and arousal since the 1950s, and that is people go into a sort of tunnel vision, a narrowing of attention, where we lock onto the most tangible element of the problem, and we lock onto that, and we mobilize everything to deal with it. And you can see that they've all got a similar expression on their face. There's a bit of difference from the effort here, but you notice there's a curious sort of blankness, unexpressive tenseness in their face. When you compare them with this bystander, you can see his face is creased with emotion because he's actually not involved. For all the people involved, you can see that the emotion is completely set aside in favour of action. And so they have this narrowed focus onto the task, they shut down their emotion, they put everything into action mode. And so this is the adrenaline mode. And what we know that adrenaline does is it releases energy from a whole series of stores of energy that's been put aside and stored up in our body for use in an emergency. It's not unlimited. And if you've ever seen someone that's been on adrenaline for too long, they eventually just collapse. But I want you to notice how unaware of themselves they are. And if you think about what will happen to this guy if he cracks his shin on something as he's evacuating it, we can see that he's not going to notice that until he comes out of arousal. We've all been through that experience, whether on the sporting field or in some dramatic moment of our lives where we sustain a bit of an injury and we don't even realise what happened. So in this state, we are unaware of ourselves. We don't make decisions according to our own welfare. We make decisions according to what's needed. And what's more, we are not registering the experience emotionally. I won't leave this up and go through it all, but we can say that this state of adrenaline is to deal with an immediate, tangible problem, and we become just a specialised organism to deal with that problem. We can see that we're on the here and now. We tend to think more in pictures. We know that to be in the right-hand side of our brain. And we have these flashbulb memories. It's simple. It's absolutely concrete. But now that state does not last indefinitely. As soon as the immediate threat subsides, the fire's out, we've found accommodation, we've got some financial relief or whatever the immediate emergency problems are, because you don't just have to have a bushfire to put you in adrenaline mode. You just need to get a bad letter from your insurance company and that'll put you in adrenaline mode too. But once things stabilise, we then have, whether you've actually lost house, infrastructure, or you just live in a disaster affected community, there's no question that everybody's lives are profoundly affected. And therefore, everyone starts to then look towards the longer term issues. And that's where there is a shift in the way our bodies work, the way our minds work, and the whole chemistry. The adrenaline is only good here and now when I've got to do something dramatic and I know what to do. That's acute stress. I've got a problem and I must deal with it now. But when we move into the next state, we're in a state of chronic stress, of enduring stress, of cumulative stress, where we look ahead and we don't know how long this is going to happen. This is, of course, happening in lockdown, isn't it? And a different chemistry starts operating in our body and puts us in a different state where we are faced with a huge problem, but there's nothing I can do immediately now to solve it. And I have to just go into a state where I endure and keep plodding away at this for however long it's going to take. And I call this endurance mode. And endurance mode is not driven by adrenaline, it's driven by cortisol. Now that's an oversimplification of the chemistry, and I'm just using that as a way of giving two different descriptions of a whole different chemistry. Now, the best picture I've got of showing this is these two hostages. They've been kidnapped by Filipino terrorists, again back in the 90s. They're German tourists, and they've been held hostage here for 6 weeks. Are we going to look like this at the end of lockdown? Have a look at their faces. They've got the same blankness. That blankness and unexpressiveness is the sure sign that the person's in a state of heightened arousal. In the adrenaline state, the blankness is harnessed to perception and action and goal, and here and now, I've got to get this done. But here in the chronic stress, there's nothing to do. There's nothing I can quickly do to resolve the problem. And you can see the brightness of the eyes, but there's nothing to look at. They're like locked into a state of enduring. And you can see there's very little interaction between them, because what happens in the endurance mode is we reorganize and narrow everything down and focus it on the task we have to do. We shut down everything unnecessary, including the emotional signaling that keeps relationships alive. And we all become egocentric, self-centered, focused on what I need to do to get through. And this is generated by the way cortisol reorganizes our bodies. And instead of using up our reserves, as adrenaline does, because we wouldn't last long enough to get through the long-term problems. What a cortisol does is absorbs energy out of our own tissues and retracts that where we need it. And so what we see is there's a profound fatigue is built up during this. But if you look at the faces, these people are not in touch with each other. The feedback system is blocked, and we are draining resources from our bodies. And what this inevitably leads to is exploiting unimportant functions to support the necessary functions. Our thinking is preserved, but in a narrow, rigid way. We oscillate between emotional numbness and simple instinctive emotional outbursts. Our more complex social emotions are reduced to the minimum. Now I'm going to stop the share here and just really try to emphasize this shift to the cortisol state. In the cortisol state, I call it the zombie mode, and we've all probably experienced zombie mode, where you can just do what you're practiced at doing. You can do anything that is well established, automatic, and familiar, because the brain reorganizes so we don't use all the complex creative parts of our brain, but we come down into that core where we can just keep doing familiar routines. And the researchers in the laboratories have shown when you put people under this stress, yes, we can certainly give you copies of these slides. When you put people under these stresses in a complex problem-solving experimental situation, as the stress increases, people can't think creatively about the problems they're being confronted. And they have a tendency to fall back on familiar strategies to try and solve the problems that they already know don't work. But they can't think of what else to do, so they do what's familiar. And I think we all know what that feels like when you actually can't think of how to do it, but you've got to do something. There's been studies on military commanders and some of the great failures and defeats where they've actually done things that they ought to know aren't going to work, but they can't think outside the box. So these are very important features of understanding about cortisol, because these are the states where people can't engage in the complex problems of making a long-term strategic plan for their recovery, in juggling resources and working out how to creatively use the money they've got, of working out how to delegate. It's too hard to delegate. You know that state when people are so stupid, you've got to explain it all to them, and then they've got their own damned idea how to do things. You say, leave it alone, I'll do it myself. And in this way, the cortisol state means you heap more and more on yourselves, and you do what you can do rather than what you need to do. And you become more and more inefficient. And I want to talk a bit later about the fact that this affects our mental capacities to do the work. We will inevitably lose the creative aspects of our thinking. And one of the things that you can see goes first is memory. People jokingly talk about being senile, but after Black Saturday, they talked about having bushfire brain. But in Queensland, they talk about having cyclone brain or flood brain or earthquake brain in Christchurch, because we know that the brain is not working very well, because we now know what's happening in the brain with the cortisol, and it does interfere with the part of our brain that organizes our memories. So you feel, not only I can't remember things, but I somehow get incredibly disorganized, and I can't be efficient. I can't make decisions. I dither and waste time. And what goes with that is attention and concentration, focus. And so people find themselves getting distracted, and they can't maintain their focus on things, and they get halfway through one task and they remember another, or they've got to get a paper and they see something else they haven't done, and they find at the end of the day they've half done 25 tasks instead of completing anything. So these, I want to just explain this, because in the whole process of getting out of this cortisol state, we must get clever and strategic. We've got limited resources and limited time. We've got to be effective. We've got to work out what is the most important thing to do and harness our resources to that. And that means we've got to recognize and move out of this adrenaline state. Now, I'm going to go on and speak about, you know, a little bit more about how we can sort of think about these stressors that are operating here as we're, you know, by 6 months down the track, a lot of people are heavily in cortisol mode. And I want to think about the stressors and how we might work with those. But I just wonder whether, for a couple of minutes, if anyone's got any questions or comments about this, these two states. I'd say that the adrenaline starts when the impact occurs, and you should move out of it when you're no longer in immediate tangible threat. And that's probably for most people within a few weeks or a month or two. Yeah, Peter Williams, have you, I think you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. With the cortisol effect, how long, you know, I mean, I know it probably depends, but what's the sort of duration of it? And, you know, how can you sort of shorten it, I suppose?
Well, it'll last as long as it takes to recover. And, you know, people can stay in cortisol for several years. My wife used to work in the coronary care unit at one of the big metropolitan hospitals as a social worker. And when people come in with their coronaries, she'd sit down on the side of the bed and talk to them. And these people would talk about having been in cortisol. No, they didn't have that language, but they, you know, somebody started their business and run their business, and they've had all sorts of problems for years. Now, often the health problems will occur not when you're in cortisol, because it's a massive stimulus and you're really harnessed. I've got to get this done. The health problems will happen 12 months or more after the end of that period. And so you'll probably, if you're not careful, stay in cortisol until you've got your house rebuilt, if you've lost a house and you've moved into your new one or whatever. And then that'll be when you feel this profound downer, exhaustion. And so what we've got to learn is to recognize the cortisol and interrupt it by coming out of it and resting. But if you try and tell someone in zombie cortisol mode that they need to take time out and rest, they'll scream at you and say, don't you realize it's been a disaster? I've got a whole lot of problems. If I don't get all this done, I'm never going to blah, 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 blah. And you realize you haven't helped them at all. You know, we've all been in it, have we? People tell me regularly I look incredibly stressed and I should, but I've got all this stuff to do for BRV and you guys, so how can I stop and rest myself, right? You know, this is exactly the sort of state of mind we need to realise. What we've lost is the feedback loop to say, gee, I feel tired. I should take half an hour off maybe, or maybe even a whole hour. No, that'd be too much, but I'll take half an hour again tomorrow. You know, we'll come back to how we maximise this. Any other questions? Do you recognise cortisol mode?
There's a good one there, Rob, about community participation in recovery planning at this phase.
Yes, it's incredibly important because we know that unless we get the community involved, the government won't, first of all, I don't work for government, I just help them out, but government won't get it right unless they get the community's input. How can they get it right? You're in the community, you know your community, so there's got to be this relationship. But also, it's so important for the community to become self-aware of itself as a community. And for that, you need some infrastructure with people who represent and convene meetings and get feedback going. And so that's essential. And so there'll be a lot of people working in the voluntary capacities that are in cortisol mode because they've got an enormous amount of additional work to do in addition to their own lives. There was another question here. How do we I'm coming to this COVID, and I think there was another question a little bit further.
Hi, Rob. Roberto
yeah,
Venturini here.
Yeah.
How are you?
Good, thanks.
Look, quick question. I think it's also building on a question that Kathy has asked as well. Her question: how best do you support someone while in this state? And building on that, some reflections on how do we best work with communities in this state, but also with one another who have got a professional role in the system. I'm assuming, I don't know if they're the same dynamics or if there's a little bit of nuance between the two.
Yeah. I want to talk in a bit more detail about how we manage it in a moment. Let's come to that question that flipped up about cumulative stress. Cumulative means the idea of cumulative is you have a small problem that you don't get a chance to recover from before you get another small problem. And so you get to the same place. But I think in essence, the first thing is we've got to try and make people aware of this state so that we actually learn to manage ourselves, not through our usual method, which is my own self-awareness, my feedback to my own state, but through knowledge. Because the feedback's not reliable when we're in these states of arousal. Cortisol's a massive stimulus, first to numb the discomfort and the fatigue, and then just to focus. So that's a great one about you can hear the cortisol in the way the person talks. They speak in an endless stream of unorganized material about their problems. And you can help someone by listening to them and then just helping them to try and make more sense. You know, that's the sort of person who'll say, I don't know where to start. I've got so much on my plate at the moment. And then they'll get this salad of problems. And then if you ask them a simple question like, hang on a second, of all the problems you've mentioned, which one is causing you the most grief at the moment, right? Or which one do you think will help you most feel better, right? And that's where you need to focus, because that's the kind of discrimination process of selecting out and then harnessing your resources to that. But that's usually a more complex problem. And that's usually the one that we look at. We have this feeling of being overwhelmed. And so we leave that and we do a whole lot of trivial stuff. Like I like to talk about farmers who, rather than look at budgets and possibilities of further loans from the bank and mortgages and so on, would say it's all too much and go out and build another couple of kilometres of fencing because they know how to do that and they get a sense of satisfaction. And of course, their wife is trying to do the figures and says, we should talk about this. And he says, I can't deal with it. And she yells at him and says, we've got to deal with it. And you get a whole lot of internal relationship stresses as people react in this in a different way. And so I think the first thing is working out, understanding this state and learning to recognize it in yourselves and in each other. And we need to harness those abilities. And people have often told me the very most useful thing they ever had to recover from a disaster was an unaffected person that they trusted and knew, who came in and said, how can I help? And just did what you asked them to do, the things that you couldn't actually get your head around. Look, let me just maybe talk a little bit about the sources of stress. And I'm just going to come back to, okay, I can't, it's telling me things I don't understand. I'm going to just go out of my...
Can I just come in with a question, Rob, if
Sure.
I can?
Yeah.
So my name's Neville Braybrook from CoHealth. I just put it there in the chat box anyway, but just given what you're describing, I guess around just helping people raise their awareness of what's going on so they can get a feel for the phenomena, is there a resource or a fact sheet that's available that would that we could provide to people that would sort of complement the conversations that we have with them around that awareness raising?
Actually, I don't think we have a simple fact sheet on this, but we could certainly get one up. If you could just pick out the issues that you think are most important for you to be able to hand out as we go through this stuff, give us a bit of an email, we can build something around that. It's a very good idea. I can talk about the value of this. One of my colleagues was running one of the support groups we had for people after Black Saturday, mainly the bereaved, but other people whose recovery was stuck. We had some monthly support groups facilitated, and my colleague told me that people would come to their group and they would say, oh, I've had a shocking month. I've been in the corduroy zone all month. And they'd talk to each other and they'd say, oh, gee, that's terrible. I've been in the corduroy zone. You can't get anything done, can you? And so on. And she couldn't work out where this was coming from. And eventually they said things which made her realize that this was their sort of garbled folklore of my talks about cortisol. And so the corduroy zone was really their name for being in the cortisol state. But it operated as a sort of name for it. And, you know, they realized that when they're in the corduroy zone, stop trying to do your recovery, you won't cope. So just concentrate on resting, relaxing, and getting out of it. And I think that's a sort of language we need for this kind of state. I just wanted to show you, now I'm not, are you seeing my slide here? Right, do you see my slide?
Not yet, Rob.
Okay, I should be sharing my screen. That would help, wouldn't it? I'll get better at this as we go.
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay, so curiously, you've got to tab everything twice. So look, these are the sources of stress. I reckon there are three main stressors after disaster. Trauma, which is the experience on the day, the threat, the danger, the triggering, etc. Now, most people, I think, put a lot of that aside when they go into cortisol mode because they've got to deal with that other stuff. That's going to start coming back to be processed. Doesn't mean they're in post-traumatic stress disorder, but the trauma is the bad experience and we don't process it very well in that cortisol mode because we've got other things we must deal with. And if people can, they'll put it aside. The second one is the loss. Now, of course, we've got the tangible losses of house, property, fences, stock, income, and so on. But there's a lot of intangible losses: friendships, social networks, environment. The natural environment is an incredibly important amenity. For many people, it is their major stress management device, to go for a walk in the forest and the familiar places and the animals and so on. So the response to loss is grief, sadness, heaviness, depression in the colloquial sense, not the clinical sense. And so you've got the trauma, which is the anxiety and the fear and the activation, which will be triggered by various issues, maybe nightmares even, or just simply loud noises and strong wind, even if it's in the winter. And then you've got the loss, which is the sadness and heaviness and what we're missing. There's a lot of loss being experienced in COVID shutdown. But the third point is really, I think, in some ways the most important, because it's the most pervasive across every area, and that's the disruption of the routines of our life. When we live life in a routine, we don't have to think about what we're doing. We know where things are, we know what we're going to do next, we know how to do it. And that releases an enormous amount of mental attention and space. And if you look at what we do when we're doing things in routine, we've always got a part of our mind that is free to turn things over, to reflect on the past, to plan for the future, to cope with emotions, to think about problems, to get a perspective on things. And when we're in a disrupted lifestyle, and everyone is in these affected communities, we've got to work everything out from the beginning. So that means we've got to use all of our attention doing trivial stuff. And we lose this, I call it mulling things over, which is incredibly important for getting a perspective. And the loss of perspective is a major problem in chronic stress. Now, these are the three disaster-related stresses, but I think we also have what I call the generic stressors. And the research again shows us that whenever we're dealing with novelty, that is a new experience that's beyond my previous experience, I have to actually focus on it and invent my response to it. Whenever we're dealing with uncertainty, we can't actually make clear decisions. We've got to juggle it and focus. And that creates, and these experiments have shown if you submit poor old rats to novelty, uncertainty and conflict, then they'll have stress chemicals in their bloodstream. And conflict is not interpersonal conflict, although that's a very big stressor, but it's the conflict of having a choice and not having enough information to know which is the right choice, or not being able to make it. So novelty, uncertainty, conflict. And I think that just illustrates the multiple problems that you have, whether you're on a community recovery committee and you're trying to deal with a whole lot of government stuff that's unfamiliar and make decisions and plans and put submissions in and do strategic plans and whatever else. This is all incredibly difficult. Or whether you're actually got novelty, uncertainty and conflict because you're having to negotiate with the council about building a house and you've never done this before. These are very preoccupying activities, and they will multiply the stress of the disasters, of the disaster-related stressors. And so many of these stressors are intangible. Now, I think if the cortisol gets too high, we go into crisis. Because, now I've had to invent these names for them because I'm talking about not mental illness or mental disorders. I'm talking about the mental dysfunction of healthy people who are submitted to too much stress for too long so that things stop working as well. And the terms I've invented are cognitive disruption. So I'm a normal, intelligent person. I haven't lost my intelligence or my education or my experience, but I just can't think about it today. I'm over it. I can't work it out. I can't deal with this problem. I'm going to go and build another kilometre of fences. Or I'm going to pull weeds in the garden instead of actually making a submission for a grant. Emotional overload, which is, I just can't cope with this. And if anyone talks to me, I'm going to yell at them. Or if anyone talks to me, I'm going to burst into tears or whatever. I'm just emotionally overloaded. I've got nowhere to go. And action impotence. I really should do this. I would really pick up the phone and make this awkward phone call. It would make my life so much easier, but I can't do it today. It doesn't matter what you do. You can point a gun at my head. I just can't do it. I'm over it. Now, you know, I think we all get into these states at times, you know, I think we've got to give them their due. We've got to respect them. They are normal dysfunctions when you're at the end of your resources. And I want to talk for the remaining time about how we deal with that. But just before we have another short break, talk about what does COVID do. COVID will actually give us I have got a slide here somewhere, but I'm not going to get it in time. There are two basic issues with COVID. One is the threat. That's a cause for anxiety because it's invisible and insubstantial. Anxiety brings us into an emotional state, puts us back towards adrenaline, running around. I can't find a virus. What we've got to do is we've got to calm down and preserve our thinking and say, hang on a second. There's medical specialists have told us what to do to avoid. I saw on the TV last night, if you practice 1.5 social distancing, it reduces your chance of getting COVID by 80%. If you have 2.5 metres, it reduces that 20% by another 80%. And if it's 3 metres, then your chance is halved again. So this sort of information is really reassuring, isn't it? That if you stay that far apart from each other, from infected people, you're very much like, this is what they worked out with people working in the health system. And we know about washing our hands and masks and all the rest of it. So what we've got to do is harness the anxiety into action mode, and have a confidence and trust in what the medical specialists are telling us. The second thing is we've got to have a strategy for dealing with the isolation. And I want to make some comments about that in a moment. But I wondered whether anyone wanted to say anything about these, because the novelty, uncertainty and conflict are happening in working from home and being in isolation. Has anyone got any questions or comments?
It's Bev Clarke here. I work with the financial counsellors. My concern is with the bushfire areas, many people don't have homes they can work from. Their situation is quite precarious without COVID, and then you add COVID onto it. That's what I want to know, how that impact is with people who are already disrupted and have been through a trauma and then a further trauma. And I suppose the example of them saying we don't want people to come up.
Yes.
Yeah, so
yes.
I just wondered what the particular problems
as
are.
As opposed to the tourist operators who are really hanging out for them to come up so they get a bit of income.
Yeah, that's right. So
I conflicting needs. That's right. So what we can add to the generic stresses are inconvenience, lack of space, lack of internet provision. You know, all the hassles and nuisances and loss of privacy and fatigue and so on. All of these things just up the cortisol state. And so what I think is so important for people is to actually think about the things they can change that give them some greater sense of routine in their lives. I think I've worked with quite a lot of groups who are struggling with the online thing. And I think to develop rituals and routines around your work. I've been working with a woman who hates being at home. She loves going to work. It's her way of getting away from things. She lives by herself. And, you know, I said, is there some way you can actually, she's got a very small place. She hasn't got a separate room. I said, is there some way you can mark you know, when you're working and when you're not. And we worked out that she's gone out and bought some flowers that's got some really happy associations with her. She has this bunch of flowers and she puts it up in her room when she's going to be at work. And then she puts it in the kitchen when she's at home. And she's got a little way of marking the movement back and forth, even though it's only one room to another. It doesn't matter what we do. If we set up rituals and symbols, we will find we will feel anchored, because the rituals and symbols are there in a physical location. I wanted to just come back to this question of energy. I think this is a really important thing. The cortisol drains the energy out of our tissues, and we get a form of fatigue that I call cellular fatigue. The cells of our body gets tired, which isn't the same as saying I feel tired after a busy day's work, because we know that in that cortisol state, you can lock into a state where you could work, you know, until the early hours of the morning. And it's only in the morning, next morning, when you try and get out of bed, you realize how exhausted you are. And that's a dangerous state. And that what's really going on here is that the absorption of a buffer of energy that is used to keep our body going. I think we have a similar buffer to keep our mind going, which is in some way our mind protests, and we kind of, people find they constantly get distracted onto things they prefer to focus on than the things they have to focus on, because they're looking for a reward. Reward equals enjoyment. Enjoyment equals building energy. And so you get this problem of attention and concentration because I'm hungry. Our bodies get hungry, and so we get the temptation to eat high energy foods, you know, Mars bars and coffee instead of a wholemeal sandwich, and so on. And so you get this drift in this cortisol state for stimulus, trying to get this additional energy. What we notice is that when the energy is too low, we can't hold things at bay the way we did with our thinking. The trauma, for instance, the sadness of the loss, the frustration we have with other people. And so we become irritable and unstable and hypersensitive. The disrupted routines means I never feel I can just relax. I'm always having to work things out. And hence the importance of actually putting time, energy, money, resources into building routines. And one of the disorganizing effects of COVID is we've lost our routines. So give time to building routines, and we will build a routine if we simply do the same things at the same time every day. You might need to use some thinking and planning in how to do it effectively and efficiently, because that will be a tremendous support. It will release a certain amount of energy, and to use a bit of decision making and planning, whatever you can have, to actually start designing a routine that will help you through this. And what we actually need in order to build this energy to help us get through is those features that have been shown time and again to be associated with, I hate to use the word resilience. Resilience is bandied around in a very superficial way, but what gives us resilience is, first of all, having a sense of understanding what's going on. And that for that, we need information. We need information about ourselves, about the system, about other people, about what's available. And in disasters, particularly when you're in this narrowed attention, you're actually looking for what you want, not necessarily what you need. And that's why having people in circulation talking to each other, they suddenly realize, oh, I hadn't realized that. Or, oh, wow, where did you find that out? And so this exchange as part of a community compensates for the stress state. What comes up out of this is self-awareness. That's a major resilience factor, self-awareness. We get self-awareness by having our own story reflected back to us. And I think we need opportunities to tell our stories and listen. People in cortisol mode are boring to people who are not in cortisol mode because they go on and on and on saying the same thing many times. But we actually need to really understand that we can be of great help to them by offering them that listening ear and then helping them. This question I said before, of all these problems, which is the most important to you? And what are you doing about that? Don't try and solve the problem for them, because they're usually not receptive to solutions, and often people will be suggesting things they've already tried. But listening to them, helping them think, offering them social support. The resilience factors are things like hope, confidence, optimism. And we get these not by being told, you know, you should be hopeful, I'm sure it'll be all right in the end, but really listening to them and participating with them and sharing things. You know, we can get a sense that maybe we'll get through it even if we share our problems with each other, and we have this sense of connection. Because what I wanted to emphasize was the important role of social support. Now, ideally, this is happening because everyone's meeting together and have nice meals once a week. With COVID, we've got a problem, but any way we can communicate together will do the job in a better or worse manner. But we've got to find ways of networking and communicating. It's the quality, not the quantity, of communication that gives us a feeling of being supported. Being supported depersonalizes the situation. It's not me, it's the situation. We lose that perspective in the cortisol mode. It's almost universal that people in high stress cortisol mode are continuously failing to do what they ought to do. They're doing it badly. They are aware in their own mind how ineffectual and inefficient and disorganized they are. And so you get this massive loss of self-esteem. I feel hopeless. I feel defeated. I feel despondent. I'm not the person I used to be. And if you realize that everybody's in it the same, we're all in the corduroy zone, then you actually say, it's not me, it's the corduroy zone. I've got to get out of the corduroy zone. How do we get out of the corduroy zone? Well, we actually, the first thing is collective identity. Stress individualizes us. Stress makes us egocentric. Stress makes us self-centered. And the resources we should have, which is the people who love us or like us or care about us, these relationships come under pressure because we're all behaving in an egocentric, oversensitive, demanding state. And so the more we can realize this as a universal experience we're all going through to a greater or lesser degree, joke about it, exchange notes, depersonalize it. When somebody's irritably grumping at us, can we just say, instead of saying, don't you talk to me like that, if you, I've got my own problem, you know? And what we need to actually do is say, oh, sorry, you're in the corduroy zone, are you? I'll wait till you're out. Or something like that. Anything we can do to develop a sense of collective identity. We belong to this group. And bushfire affected people have a very clear sense of the boundary when they talk to people outside the bushfire affected area, and they don't get it. They don't understand. They come up with simplistic solutions. But it's the sharing of the experiences that will build this sense of collective identity. Stories and narratives. Ask people what they've been thinking about rather than how they feel. That's often too sensitive. What have you been doing? What are you dealing with at the moment? And then as the conversation goes, the feelings will come more spontaneously to the fore. So it's that quality of sharing that brings about the change and gives us a sense of I'm not alone in it. Aloneness and isolation are dangerous in this state because we get on that slippery slope from despondency to depression to wondering what's the point of it all. The point of it all is to actually rejoin the community that makes life worthwhile, and to actually go through this time together. And just as a sort of concluding point, I would say, if we do it slower, take more time out to get out of cortisol, return to our baseline sense of ourselves, we not only recoup energy, which we can then use in the next lot of stress, but we actually reconnect with our roots and our values. And that's where the meaning and value of life lie, right? Our goals, our values, our meanings, our relationships, and so on. It's terribly important not to get sidetracked by all the urgent material problems. Therefore, do it slower and hang on to a lot of these other parts of your life. Don't put anything important aside until you've got everything sorted, because it'll be damaged. And that means investing time, energy, resources, and money into recreation, leisure, and unwinding. There will be material benefits from this. A man who ran a caravan park that was severely affected in a Black Saturday town told me that after hearing one of my talks, he went away with his family to Bali for, I think, a couple of weeks. He couldn't really afford it, but he did it. He said, when I came back, I achieved more in 3 days than I'd achieved in the preceding 3 weeks. You know, he could just do things, and we all know this. Look, those are a few points. We will cover other points in the next webinars, but I just wonder in the last few minutes whether anyone's got any thoughts or questions or aspects. I know there's a lot of chats comes in. We'll try and harness those for the next presentations. Body-based practices, yes. Anything that helps your body lose its tension and unwind. I think that there's a great role for complementary therapies, whether it be aromatherapy, massage, yoga, whatever. If you're into it and it helps you, do it. And if your friend tells you they've tried this, that, or the other and it's been helpful, give it a go and see if it helps. Nothing works for everyone, and almost anything works for somebody. You have to work out, you know, what suits you.
Well, I think we'll have to leave it there, Rob. We're bang on 11 o'clock. So if there's extra questions, we can take them offline and address them that way, or in the next webinar, which is on the 26th of August. And you can register for that webinar through the BRV website, or you can also email engage@brv.vic.gov.au. And we will also share the slides from today.
And I think we've also got 2 hours for the next 2 seminars.
Yes,
so we'll have a bit more time for a bit of question and answer, and we can pick up issues from today's presentations too, if you need to. But please give us the questions so we can build things around what's important to you.
So thank you so much, Rob.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Incredibly insightful, and thanks everybody for joining today.
Thank you.
Look forward to talking to you again.